Audio is rolling. Camera is rolling. All right, Tim. Action.
Hello, my name is Tim Malone and I'm a retired history teacher. I taught American history for 25 years at Elgin Community College in Elgin, Illinois. I've decided to tape some of my lectures and put them up on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel. Search Tim Malone History Lectures. And I think there's some 20 some up there now. Today, I want to talk about Woodrow Wilson and World War I. Now, when I taught, I had two separate lectures, Woodrow Wilson and World War I. However, it's hard to talk about Woodrow Wilson without talking about World War I. And it's hard to talk about World War I without talking about Woodrow Wilson. So the two lectures merge. And it's necessary, it seems to me, to cut back and forth between Woodrow Wilson, the man, the President of the United States, his domestic policy, his foreign policy before American entry into World War I, and then talking about Woodrow Wilson as the president that led us into World War I and went to Paris in 1919 to personally oversee the peace treaty, the Versailles Treaty, ending World War I. The two topics get mixed up. So I guess I'm apologizing in advance for the fact that we'll be back and forth between Woodrow Wilson and World War I in this lecture. And probably there'll be a Woodrow Wilson and World War I Part 2. So first off, Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States. He's generally considered to be one of our better presidents. Usually he's in the top 10 when such public opinion polls are taken about past presidents. He's a very, very complicated figure, and I have mixed feelings about him. He's generally, I believe, covered very, very positively in American history and in American history books. I think there's an unjustified bias in the coverage of Woodrow Wilson in American history books. And again, it's complicated. Wilson was a political science professor, the only college professor, full-time college professor president we've ever had. And that tells you something. I'll come back and make my jokes about how no college professors were president again. He was taught at Princeton in New Jersey. Then he became president of Princeton University. Then he became governor of New Jersey for just 2 years, and then president of the United States. It's rather a meteoric rise politically for Wilson. There's no doubt that Wilson was smart. He wrote books on American government. He taught American government. He was one of the top thinkers about politics and American government when he became president. And in the sense of being able to get what he wanted done, well, except for the treaty, we'll get to that, he was very successful in getting Congress to do what he wanted Congress to do. Wilson was the first and the only president who would go to Capitol Hill. When the Congress was debating something he wanted, the President of the United States would be just off the floor of the House or the Senate. There's Wilson, just standing right there, watching what's going on. He was very good at getting what he wanted. He was supposedly a very, very good orator, a very good speaker. And I don't know, again, it's something that I should try to figure out or find, if there's any recordings of Wilson giving a speech, because he's right there. He becomes president in 1913 till 1921. He serves 2 terms. And that's just at the very beginning of recording, electronic recordings of speeches. I don't know. I should look and see, because I have yet to hear Wilson speak, but he's supposedly a spellbinder giving a speech. He was very smart. He was a college professor. He was a PhD in political science. So I'm not saying that this idea that he was one of our more effective presidents, the question is, to what end? To what end? I'm not a very big Wilson fan. In fact, I like to tell people I hate him. But he was very influential in American history. I don't know, since Lincoln, well, there's Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. Wilson, in terms of being influential in making American history, in making the world what it is today. Today. And this is February 27th, 2025. Today. Wilsonianism is in the news today. The war in Ukraine is Wilsonianism in action, is Wilsonianism in conflict with American isolationism. And we'll come back to that here in a little while. Today, Wilson rules. American support for the Ukraine resistance to the Russian invasion is Wilsonianism. Now the news guys, they don't mention it, they don't use the term, but that's what it is. And President Trump today, it's hard to tell, but seems to be an anti-Wilsonian, which he would be the first president since Franklin Roosevelt, since the end of World War II, 1945. With the end of World War II in 1945, Wilson conquers the world in terms of the United States as overwhelming superpower and the United States world order. Since 1945, so this is 80 years. For 80 years, Democrat, Republican presidents have all been Wilsonians until Trump. And we'll see how that works out, because the Wilsonian tradition is powerful. Woodrow Wilson, alive today, despite the fact that, of course, when he left office in 2021, he was a broken man physically and politically. They didn't have public opinion polls back then, but it's most historians believe that when Woodrow Wilson left office, he was scraping the bottom of the barrel. He'd had one of the greatest rises and one of the most precipitous falls of any politician in American history. He caused, World War II. Again, we'll come back and we'll talk more about that. He's best known for leading the United States into World War I and then playing a big role in the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, that ended that war. He was the first president to leave the country. He got on a ship in the end of 1918, and the beginning of 1919, and went to Paris for the peace conference to end World War I, which produced the Versailles Treaty, which is reviled now. The Versailles Treaty caused World War II. The Versailles Treaty was stupid. We'll come back to the stupid. Wilson wasn't stupid, but quite the opposite. But he created a world order, a new world order, self-consciously, right, that failed miserably and caused World War II and all the horrors of World War II, and then set up the world after World War II that we still live in today, by and large. The Wilsonian consensus, I call it. Wilson's one of the few Americans that has an ism named after him, Wilsonianism. And Wilsonianism is a very interesting word. I did some research on Wilsonianism, sort of an etymology of it. It's one of those words, Wilsonianism, that, again, I just said, conquered the world to this day, and yet it's not in the dictionary. It's not in the glossaries of most history books. Wilsonianism. Of course, Wilson is, but Wilsonianism, the ism, ISM turns adjectives into nouns. Wilsonianism, the ideology, the doctrines, the viewpoints of a Wilsonian. And again, let me repeat, every president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the end of World War II has been a Wilsonian, except, again, but we'll see, who's going to win? Trump, bringing back American isolationism, repudiating Wilsonianism, or Wilson? Trump versus Wilson. Right now, today, as I'm talking to you, that's going on. And yet the background of American foreign policy, the Wilsonianism of American foreign policy, is not much discussed and is often not adequately discussed in the history books. I don't know if I've said this already, but I'll say it again. Most college-level history books, and I have a bunch of them, are biased in favor of Woodrow Wilson, in my opinion. They glorify him. They are biased in his favor. Again, I have a list here of some historians talked about, and he's usually in the top 10 of presidents. Sometimes as high as 4 or 5. Of course, you got Lincoln, Washington, and FDR, the top 3 presidents in American history, usually generally, right? And then you got Teddy Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is considered to be one of our better presidents. There's reason to doubt that. I have articles that say he was the worst president we've ever had because he was so effective in getting his Wilsonianism, after World War II. Again, Wilsonianism was considered a failure in 1920 and 1919. American isolationism after the misadventure of World War I. And what is it? Walter Karp, who I'll talk about more later, says Woodrow Wilson led an unwilling nation into an unnecessary war. American entry into World War I, which Wilson, in his political brilliance, manipulated the country into. Again, World War I was before public opinion polls, but most historians agree that if public opinion poll had been taken, even after Germany declares unrestricted submarine warfare and starts sinking American ships, even then most overwhelming Americans did not want to get into that war. Wilson wanted to get into that war. He manipulated an unwilling nation into an unnecessary war. And we're going to talk about World War I more in the second version of this lecture. World War I is one of the true turning points in all of history. World War I and the way it ended, American entry into it, deciding the war in favor of the Allies, and then the peace treaty that was one of the worst treaties ever. World War I, just a little preview, I call it the stupid war because the way the war started was stupid. The way the war was fought was stupid. And the peace treaty that ended it was stupid. It hit the trifecta, World War I. Stupid, stupid, stupid. And we're paying the price, in some ways, we're paying the price for that stupidity today. Still, Wilsonianism. And then let me pause right here and say, there's reasons, I have a lot of good reasons to hate Woodrow Wilson as president. But I'm a Wilsonian in some important ways. I'm a Wilsonian. What does that mean? Well, we'll talk about Wilsonianism. Wilsonianism is a form of American exceptionalism. So let me talk a little bit here about Wilsonianism. I want to zero in on that term here for a little while. Woodrow Wilson today is still pertinent, still important in American history because of the term Wilsonianism. Wilson founded that ideology, which has dominated the foreign policy of the United States since 1945. For example, today, as I said before, it is useful to think of Donald Trump as attempting to overthrow the 80-year-old Wilsonian consensus. The Wilsonian consensus in American foreign policy. Public opinion, however, even today, tends to show that a majority of Americans still support the Wilsonian consensus. In other words, when President Trump talks about withdrawing our support from Ukraine and barring Ukraine from getting into NATO, again, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a Wilsonian institution set up after World War II by Truman, who admired Wilson. Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, the two presidents at the end of World War II, were self-conscious, self-declared Wilsonians, and tried to bring about a post-World War II apply Wilsonianism. And again, Wilsonian and Wilsonianism, in my mind, I guess I'm trying to emphasize the importance of them, they're not even in the dictionary. Wilsonianism's not in the dictionary. Here's the story of the Wilsonian consensus. The story goes like this, and I've heard every president, except for Trump, in my lifetime say a version of this. If we'd only listened to Wilson, because of course Wilson goes to Paris, he negotiates the Treaty of Versailles. He doesn't get everything he wants. Primarily what he gets is the League of Nations. The League of Nations. The idea of an assembly of nations that would make war obsolete. The League of Nations. That's Wilson's baby. And he sort of sells other things out at the Treaty of Versailles in order to get England and France to agree to a League of Nations. And they do. The League turns out to be not very successful. Well, World War II happens. And after World War II, Roosevelt and Truman, the United Nations is reborn. The United Nations is League of Nations .2. And not only did we join this time, because again, Wilson brought the treaty back to the U.S. Senate, and they did not ratify it. The United States did not ratify the Versailles Treaty, which Wilson had gone to Europe as a star, right? Wilson, when he arrives in Europe in January of 1919, he draws 2 million people into the streets in Paris, the largest crowd, some historians say still, in French history. Wilson was perceived of as the savior. America entered late into the war, precise. Wilson had preached before we got into the war, and even after we got into the war, about this moralistic, idealistic vision of the peace, a peace without victors, and stuff like that. And so he was a star. He brings the treaty back, and isolationism has been reborn in the United States. The war was not popular. The World War I, despite the best efforts of Wilson and his publicists, was never popular with the American people. Never. That's something that, again, is misrepresented in our sort of pop history take. And again, we'll talk about this later on. World War I in United States cultures looked back through World War II. And again, A.J.P. Taylor, the great British historian, says they should be considered one war with a 20-year peace in return. World War II, because the Japanese attacked us, Pearl Harbor, was popular. And so we look back through World War II. Well, World War II was popular. World War I must have been too. No. World War I was never popular with the American people. And Wilson's idealism, his moral view of foreign relations, which we'll talk more about, that it can be thought of as bogus, that doesn't wear well once the war is over and Wilson's in Paris getting played by Lloyd George and Clemenceau, the leaders of Britain and France, getting played by them and selling out just about all Wilsonian idealism, selling out except for the League of Nations. He gets that. And he thinks, well, that's the big one. He comes back and the Senate won't ratify the treaty. So the United States, by the end of World War I, the most powerful nation in the world, doesn't join the League of Nations. Wilson's baby. And the story goes, after World War II, after Hitler in World War II, the story goes, if only the United States had listened to the great prophet Woodrow Wilson and ratified the treaty and joined the League, and perhaps most crucially, left American troops in Europe, the great power, joining up the League of Nations, actively involved in the peace settlement, there would have been no Hitler in World War II. The United States missed its chance, shirked, went back into isolationism, and the big dog, the most powerful dog, can't do that. That's the Wilsonian consensus. Don't do that, America. Don't go home. The world needs you. We're the indispensable nation. That's part of Wilsonianism. That's what I said. Wilsonianism is very powerfully American exceptionalism. Wilson thought that the United States was special, that the United States, and Wilson was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and he kind of acted like that, that the United States was deemed by God to be the leader of the world, that the United States is indispensable to world peace and world development. Have you ever heard that before? I mean, that kind of stuff is still, right, in the American, we're number one. We're not just number one economically and militarily, but morally, ethically, idealistically, the whole world wants to be America. Wilson thought that. The whole world should be America. Wilson thought that. The Wilsonian consensus. The world needs us. We can't go home. And that's what's happening in Ukraine. That's what's happening right now, today. Right now, today. Wilsonianism, a Wilsonian drama. Will Wilsonian hold, or will Trump succeed in reasserting a form of American isolationism? Because before Wilson, before American entry into World War I, well, except in the Caribbean and Mexico, where Wilson had started American interventionism before we got into World War I. See, Wilson and Wilsonianism is complicated. It's not simple, and he's not a simple president to talk about. Again, in our culture, he's considered a good president, an above average president. To me, I have ambivalent feelings about him, and we'll talk about the negatives, the megalomania, the moral certitude, the uncompromising, I'm right. I'm always right. He was a college professor. I laugh because, of course, I was one, sort of. And I knew them, of course. And megalomaniacs, moral certitude, my way or the highway. That sounds familiar. The Wilsonian consensus, Wilsonianism, very, very pertinent, very, very important today. It describes American foreign policy. Again, it is important to note that both Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, the presidents who forged the peace after World War II were self-professed Wilsonians and attempted not to repeat the error of not ratifying the Versailles Treaty, not being involved. There are American troops in Europe today, still. 80 years after the end of World War II, there's American troops in Germany. There's American military bases across Europe. Today, NATO, which is an American alliance dominated by the United States, has grown. Ukraine wants in. That's one of the things Putin says the reason he invaded Ukraine was to keep them out of NATO. NATO, Wilsonianism. United Nations, Wilsonianism. USAID, which is controversial today because Trump is attempting to eradicate it. The department of the government that sends food to famine-stricken areas and doctors to plague areas. Trump is trying to dismantle it. USAID, Wilsonianism. America, policemen of the world. America, doctors to the world, food to the world. American exceptionalism, the indispensable nation. So Wilsonianism brought us the Cold War after World War II, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the nuclear balance of terror, nukes, and the way they've been deployed and rattled, the consequence of Wilsonianism. American involvement in the Korean War, 38,000 Americans dead. American involvement in Vietnam, 58,000 Americans dead. Yes, Vietnam, my generation's war, was Wilsonianism in action. Why did we go into Vietnam in March of 1965? To save South Vietnamese democracy. I was there, I was alive, I remember. To save South Vietnamese democracy and freedom. American involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq and in the Middle East generally, still very prominent, very pertinent. The current American involvement in the present war in Ukraine, like I've said, in which one of the issues is Ukrainian membership in NATO, and the current 750 American military bases around the world. 750 American Wilsonianism. The world's policemen. Wilson thought that was inevitable, that was undeniable. As an American, you might say, close them bases down and bring them home. No, you can't do that. The world needs us. We're special. We have a special role. Nobody else can do it. That's what Wilson thought. Now let's recall the basic elements of Wilsonianism. All right. Number one, worldwide promotion of political democracy. No matter how loosely defined, and at the point of a gun if necessary, you're going to have democracy. South Vietnam. Idealism and moralism, as defined by the United States. Internationalism. The UN, NATO, NAFTA, these trade agreements, which again Trump is trying to dismantle. International trade agreements, Wilsonian. American exceptionalism, the indispensable nation, the leader of the free world. Wilsonianism, not enough talked about, not examined enough in our current situation. Where did American foreign policy come from? It came from Woodrow Wilson, American entry into World War I, and the failure of the Versailles Treaty, which Wilson had personally negotiated, and then World War II. And man, we're not going to make that mistake again. The United States can't come home. They'll screw it up. There'll be World War III.